specialist at the Park Library in UC Berkeley.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Grimes. I'm the archivist for the Planning and Development Department in the city of Philadelphia.
Hi, I'm Miranda Rectenwald. I'm an archivist, and my role is curator of local history and the Special Collections Department at Washington University in St. Louis.
And we are presenting today on trauma-informed care and archives. So to start off with, we'll start with a content warning. This presentation includes discussions of police brutality, mishandling of human remains, incarceration, infant mortality, suicide, institutional racism, and anti-Semitism. So a lot that we're going to cover today. And actually, in sharing and providing transparency, we are adhering to one of the 6 core principles of trauma-informed care. So we are starting off our presentation off on the right foot. We're going to go through kind of our TPS information right away here. If you need closed captioning, I believe that you can click on that on your computer for that to kind of pop up. So what is TPS Fest? It is an annual gathering and it is in person starting around 2014 and virtual since 2020. It's individuals who teach with primary source materials, and it's a place to share ideas and learn collectively. TPS Fest sessions are largely practical and are typically formatted to prioritize conversation and idea sharing. TPS Fest usually isn't made up of formal conference presentations, and there are no keynotes. Instead, we're interested in opening up a space for conversations and work that we don't get to do elsewhere. And our presentation, I would say, definitely is going to follow this. We hopefully won't go over, but we might, and we do want to provide some space for conversation. And reminders for facilitators and participants, we are okay with our session being recorded, and it is. We do not have a moderator. I will be moderating conversation questions after my part of the presentation, and we'll kind of go from there. And oh, the closed captions are, you can turn them on in your Zoom toolbar. That's where you turn them on. All right. So let's begin. My name is Rachel Weiher. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently the collections archivist at Macalester College. Today we are looking and talking about trauma-informed care in archival settings. My colleagues and I will discuss what trauma-informed care looks like, archiving with trauma-informed care. We look at intergenerational trauma and racial trauma. I wanted to talk first because I have experience in this field and because I think it's important to have a basis of what trauma-informed care is. Previous to my work in archives, I worked for 10 years on an adolescent dual diagnosis psych ward. I have my master's in counseling from the University of Minnesota, focusing on co-occurring chemical dependency and mental health disorders in adolescents. And then I got my second master's in art history and museum studies from the University of St. Thomas. These don't seem like they're related, but I hope that through our presentation you can kind of see that both of these things are kind of go hand in hand. So in the psych ward around year 5 of my work there, we transitioned from a typical behavioral psych model to a trauma-informed care model. This was a huge change, and it's one that took around an entire year to implement. Now, trauma-informed care in a psych setting is obviously very different from trauma-informed care in an archival setting. In the psych world, we wanted to reduce the amounts of behavioral holds and be able to provide care that would lead to less hospitalizations. I remember vividly the learning curve that was associated with this change. The first patients we worked with using this trauma-informed model typically had some sort of oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, borderline personality, and PTSD. At first, this model was frustrating because at its core, trauma-informed care is about patience, listening, and collaboration. So previously, when a patient was threatening to harm themselves or others, the result was a behavioral hold. And this changed in the trauma-informed care model. In trauma-informed care, we are looking not to be a punisher or an all-powerful force. We are looking to work together to solve whatever problem there was. And let me tell you, other psych floors were frustrated by how long we are taking to de-escalate patients. Again, the previous model would implement a hold almost immediately, and now we are spending hours processing and working with patients to avoid a hold, a behavioral hold or restraint and re-traumatization at all costs. And in this, we were successful in our transition to a trauma-informed model. I could talk about my work in the psych ward for hours. It taught me a lot. It was really difficult at times. But what I want to talk about today is the transition from working from trauma-informed care in the psych world to working in it with a trauma-informed care in the archival world, because I think there's actually quite a lot of overlap. And just to start us off, let's discuss what trauma-informed care is. Trauma-informed care takes a trauma-informed approach to the delivery of behavioral health services that includes an understanding of trauma and an awareness of the impact it can have across settings, services, and populations. Trauma-informed care views trauma through an ecological and cultural lens and recognizes that context plays a significant role in how individuals perceive and process traumatic events, whether they're acute or chronic. It is essential to acknowledge that the archival field's colonial history and its role in perpetrating trauma, particularly within marginalized communities, is significant. Put succinctly by Wright and Lauren in their publication titled Safety, Collaboration, and Empowerment, Trauma-Informed Archival Practice, archives both create as well as document trauma, From this understanding, we can move on to the 6 core principles of trauma-informed care. First and arguably most important is safety, and that is creating a physically and emotionally safe environment for all individuals. Second is trustworthiness and transparency. This is establishing trust through open communication, honesty, and consistency. Third is peer support and mutual help. This is fostering a sense of community and collaboration among individuals with a lived experience of trauma. 4 is collaboration and mutuality, working in partnership with individuals, families, and communities to ensure their voices are heard and respected. 5 is empowerment, voice, and choice, providing opportunities for individuals to make informed decisions about their own recovery and care. Lastly, we have cultural, historical, and gender issues. This is understanding and respecting the unique experiences of individuals from diverse cultural and historical and gender backgrounds. Now, upon hearing these 6 core principles, you may think that you have already applied some of this to your archival work, and that's probably absolutely true. So why do we want to, and why are we even talking about trauma-informed care in archives? As I kind of alluded to earlier, archives regularly document and preserve human rights abuses, racist or discriminatory laws, and institutional practices, settler colonialism ideals, and other histories which can negatively impact both the archivists who are processing the collections and researchers or communities accessing these collections. Indeed, the very buildings and means of control institutions implement to protect these histories can be viewed as traumatic. Documents and artifacts are only made available under certain controlled environments, which some find withholding and inaccessible. As archivists, we must attempt to navigate these significant barriers while making ourselves and our collections available to the public. This is no small task, and it is imperative that we begin to understand how trauma can affect the archival world. So now I want to talk about some of the trauma-informed archival work I have done. First, I want to talk about the Minneapolis uprising after the murder of George Floyd. I lived a couple of blocks away from George Floyd Square, and I actually wrote my thesis on George Floyd Square as a sacred space in conjunction with Janelle, who's the caretaker of the square. I conducted trauma-informed interviews with caretakers of the square and discussed how this sacred space evolved. I also was involved as a neighborhood watch for the square. During this time, I was also involved in a Black-led organization called Memorialize the Movement, where we collected plywood murals that store owners had put up during the uprising. We later inventoried and photographed all of the hundreds of boards in the middle of freezing winter and Photoshop stitched them together to create an archive. All of this work was deeply rooted in trauma, and it was pervasive throughout the entire project. Now, I don't have time to go through exactly what trauma-informed principles we used. Maybe that could be another presentation. But we can talk about this collection, but we can't talk about this collection without looking at the trauma that was constantly present in the work. To speak to this trauma, I want to mention, here's another couple slides that I wanted to share. To speak to the trauma, I want to mention another group I was a part of called the Urban Art Mapping Projects, where we looked at graffiti related to the uprising. Here I documented graffiti and mapped where it was located in Omika. This was a community-led organization. This led to some interesting observations, including what type of graffiti was created, quick tags versus full murals, and what was the racial majority in the neighborhood in which that was created. What we found was more emotional and quickly created graffiti was created in Black neighborhoods, while in more gentrified white neighborhoods had more decorative murals with generally positive messages. In the first picture, you can see on the left, it's a Sherwin-Williams paint store at the border between what was a Black and white neighborhood. The message says, "Reform, united in love." And the second picture beneath the storefront located in a Black neighborhood says, "Mama, I can't breathe," and "Do not let them change the narrative." We can clearly see the difference between the tone of the first two pictures. The first calls for solidarity and unity together, while the second is direct in its call for change. Again, I don't have time to talk extensively about our research, but I did include links in the previous slide about where you can access this information to look at it further, including the Urban Art Mapping Project on Omika, as well as our publication, the Urban Art Mapping Project, a discussion of street art preservation and anti-racism in the Journal of Folklore and Education. Lastly, today, I want to talk about a book chapter I've recently written. The book is titled A Practical Guide to Trauma-Informed Archival Practice, and it is going to be published by Rowman and Littlefield Publishers. Here we talk about the importance of trauma-informed care in archival work and specifically discuss secondary trauma. We conducted an anonymous and voluntary survey at the University of Minnesota Archives and Special Collections to gauge staff's understanding of secondary trauma and focus on specific demographics of workers. In this instance, we were looking at students. Our survey asked the following questions. 1, what do you know about vicarious or secondary trauma? And to give context, exposure to traumatic events of others can lead to secondary trauma. And it kind of follows the symptomology of PTSD. So although archival work isn't typically listed as a field affected by trauma, secondary trauma has become increasingly recognized in archival studies and conferences. That's just to give a little bit of context. Our second question was, have you worked with collections, donors, or researchers in a way that you consider traumatic? Traumatic is defined as something upsetting, painful, or disturbing that impacts the person. 3, what resources are you aware that the university has made available for support while processing a traumatic collection or working with donors or researchers that could cause secondary trauma? And have you accessed these resources? And 4, how have you managed student work around potentially traumatic collections? Focusing on the first question of this presentation, specifically for this presentation, 16 individuals in total responded to the survey, with 62.5% of respondents reporting having worked with traumatic collections, 25% reporting unsure, and 12.5% reporting saying that they had not worked with such collections. So this response in general really highlights the lack of knowledge around secondary trauma or trauma in general and the need for further education. How can you know if you're affected by trauma if you do not know what trauma is defined as? Overall, the staff responses we received, especially for student workers, highlighted the importance of prioritizing student well-being, communication, and informed decision making when it came to navigating potentially traumatic collections. And it's important that to note that many of the staff were attempting to implement some of these things, which fall under the category of trauma-informed care, even without having that knowledge. So again, I can't talk too much about this in our presentation because we have such a limited amount of time, and I want to let my colleagues have a chance to speak as well. So with this kind of end, I will move on to our next presenter.
Hello, everyone. I am Leanne Titangos. I use she, her pronouns. I'm half white and half Asian, which means I have, for my entire life, never really knew where I was supposed to stand on certain parts of conversations. I currently work at the Bancroft Library. It's the largest special collection at UC Berkeley in California. I started out as a student in 2005 and I never left. I started teaching informally in 2012 and I officially became the instruction specialist in 2014. I actually only just got my library degree last spring, so I've been doing everything backwards. I learned to run before I could walk, so now I'm backtracking and learning how to apply actual structure, pedagogy, and whatnot to my instruction at Bancroft. So a little bit about UC Berkeley and the Bancroft Library. UC Berkeley is a land-grant university built on ancestral and unceded territory of the Chochenyo-speaking peoples. This is a tribal nation that lost federal recognition in 1925, and it does have unfortunate ties to the UC Berkeley campus because they were declared extinct by the founder of the anthropology department at UC Berkeley, Alfred Kroeber. We have about 30,000 undergraduates and over 12,000 graduate students. The campus makeup is predominantly Asian and white. While we are making strides to becoming a Hispanic serving institution, we are behind in Black and Indigenous student enrollment. A little bit more about the Bancroft Library. I mentioned we are the largest special collection on campus, and we have a formidable reputation in the West. We support campus instruction mostly through course integrated one-shots and providing research assistance for class assignments. In addition, we provide educational opportunities for student groups on campus, local high schools and elementary schools, and outside programs such as the Breath of Life Indigenous Language Revitalization Project. Many of our historical and most requested items for our classes tend to be very extractive in nature, and this is something Rachel touched upon earlier. They were collected and compiled by white men, and they're threaded with overtones of bias, racism, and colonialism. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do a very broad stroke definition of historical and generational trauma. They tend to be used interchangeably in the literature, although in some instances, historical trauma is actually considered to be a subset of generational trauma. But in broad strokes, it is the percolation of collective trauma experienced by an oppressed group down through subsequent generations. Its manifestation is both physiological and psychological, and it's often compounded by damaged cultural identity. Next slide, please. So, my first experience of trauma in the classroom was in 2013. I was I wasn't even formally teaching at the time. I was filling in for someone who abruptly retired. And this was for a sociology course that was focused on social justice. And the instructor asked me to find historical documents that would tie in with current events. Uh, this was on the heels of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I delved into this extremely comprehensive collection of Governor Pat Brown's commission on the Los Angeles riots, also known as the Watts riots. And I pulled out the interview questions that they had for the arrestees from the riots. These were major interview packets. There were 20 pages in length. The questions were very intrusive. They were looking to find not just the actual offenses of these people, but basically what their background was, what things would have led them to riot, their family background, their educational background, very invasive. And I pulled out several of these records. I did censor the personal information on the slide here, but they're actually unredacted. And so when I did present them to the class back in 2013, it did have everyone's name, their course, their case record number, and whatnot, and other identifying information. The class was about 25 students. It had only one black student in the class. She was profoundly impacted by these interview documents. She spent the entire class session with them, closely examining them. The other students, they were amazing. They gave her space. They didn't try to crowd in and, demand to see the documents. They let her have her time with them. Um, I knew then that I had done something wrong. Well, not wrong per se, but I had done something that I didn't know that caused someone to hurt, basically. I did touch base with her as she exited the room. She just thanked me for bringing the documents out, and that was the end of my interaction with that class. However, that led me to really think about what we're bringing in a class setting, what kind of supports we can give to students who may not have experienced the trauma themselves, but their families, their identities are closely tied to these very emotionally charged items. Next slide, please. I'm just going to highlight a couple other collections that I work with consistently with classes at the Bancroft Library. I'm There's two levels. Some are actually tailored to these communities. Others are more general education groups, so you'll have a broad spectrum of students participating. One of the collections that we use are our anthropological linguistic indigenous materials. These were materials that were collected by Alfred Kroeber, again, the person who declared the Muwekma Ohlone extinct. They were collected by him, his students, and his colleagues. These were very extractive in nature. They would go out in the field, interview indigenous communities. The name they used for the people they talked to, I've never really liked. It's called informants. It kind of has a negative connotation to it. Um, so when I'm working with Indigenous students, specifically with these collections, it's always important to acknowledge that tension between its extractive origin, but also their vital importance in current language revitalization and reclamation efforts, because these tend to be the last vestiges of their languages and their myths and their stories that were lost thanks to basically the genocide of indigenous communities in California. So just holding that tension and giving students space to process that is very important. And also really encouraging hands-on interactiveness with these materials. I can't emphasize enough the importance of the physical touch of these documents. These students can actually trace their great-grandparents through these documents. So it's very important that they're able to touch, hold, immerse themselves in them. And also, I do participate in digital reclamation of anything that we have that is digitized. The students know they just have to ask me, and I will make sure they get these documents to them in an electronic format. Unfortunately, the stuff that hasn't been digitized yet, we're still trying to figure out a workflow to get that process started. Uh, and then when I'm working with these collections in a more general education setting, it's also important to know that you can't just show everything to everybody. A lot of these documents are culturally sensitive, and so I will withhold from general classes. There's myths, the creation stories, they're myths. Whenever I show documents, they tend to be more of the vocabulary, like this particular document on the screen. Next slide, please. Another collection that we utilize a lot are our Japanese American evacuation and resettlement records. There has been an increased desire from the Japanese American student population and faculty on campus to work with these items in a classroom setting. Um, NARA has been suppressing a lot of these documents from their online repositories, and so there is a fear of things being whitewashed and disappearing. So these students and faculty have been really committed to confront these painful truths in response to the current political climate. Next slide, please. So the steps that I've been taking is having an open dialogue with faculty and instructors over the materials list. A lot of instructors, they want to confront hidden truths. They want to expose the dirty history of California and working with them to make sure that we're not pulling things just to shock, but to educate. With the students, I'm always transparent about the materials shown. I'll either have labels out or I'll do a walkabout before I let them loose, showing them, this is one section here. I have various stations that they know, and I also give them the choice that if they don't want to see certain stations, they're perfectly fine opting out and focusing on different sections of the display. Um, Also, one thing I found very important is the elevation of materials that are in community voices, especially those that demonstrate resilience. A lot of these sessions can be extremely heavy, and so showing these students that these communities are surviving, they're thriving, and they're creating is incredibly important. And in the instances where Bancroft doesn't have those types of materials, I always make sure to shout out to nearby institutions that do. For instance, we had a session on women's suffrage in California. All of our materials were created by wealthy white women. However, there was a very strong Black female-led presence in the suffrage movement. And the Oakland Museum, they have all those records there. So it's great to be able to say, I know we don't have it. We address those archival silences and we make sure that the students know that these materials do exist and where to find them. And lastly, just embracing the lifelong learning principle, just continuous self-education, especially focusing on the emerging scholarship from impacted communities. One that I found really helpful is the Trauma-Informed Pedagogies that's edited by Phyllis Thompson and Janice Carrillo from 2022. Has some great articles created by communities in that document. All right, on to you, Rebekah.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Hi, I'm the department archivist for the Philadelphia Planning Commission. Before we sort of dive in, I do also want to provide a disclaimer that the views in this presentation are entirely my own and do not represent the views of the Philadelphia municipal government as an entity, the planning department, or its affiliated commissions, just to sort of get that going. Next slide, please.
So I want to start this slide with a little bit of introduction about me and my career. I graduated from Gettysburg College with my bachelor's degree in history, and I've been working in and out of museums and libraries for the last 10 years. Most recently, before I came to the city, I was an educator at the Museum of the American Revolution, and I've also worked at Gettysburg National Military Park and the Seminary Ridge Museum. This is my first full-time archival job, and it has definitely put me through my paces. The collection is about 1,800 cubic feet of material across 2 floors in Center City, Philadelphia. The collection also hasn't had an archivist in over 50 years, so that means that the collection has been stewarded by the staff of the planning department and various commissions that were later added into the department. That means that it's definitely been a challenge. There are not just psychological hazards, like I'll discuss later on, but also physical hazards like suspected poison books, flammable chemicals, and that kind of thing. For more information, you can check out the Poison Book Project. It's linked at the end of the slide deck. Next slide, please. As I started to settle into my role, which I've been in for about 1.5 years now, I realized pretty quickly that I did not know very much at all about city planning, and that I really needed to get a quick primer on what was going on. So let's start out, I guess, together about what exactly the planning department does, because this will connect in and sort of, I think, showcase more about why these trauma-informed principles are so important in our collection. So broadly speaking, if any sort of construction, building, public art goes up in the city, we have had a hand in it somehow. Any sort of public art goes through the art commission. Anytime there's a warehouse that's being adapted into a grocery store, it's probably gone before our zoning board to make sure we can bring those amenities to new areas. We work with the streets department on safe transport and things like bike lanes. And we also have the historical commission under our umbrella, which helps preserve a lot of our historic housing stock, which is one of the oldest in the nation. We also just broadly do a lot of surveys of the people of Philadelphia to try and figure out what they are interested in, what they want for their communities, and also just to gather information that we can then pass on to people like City Council and help inform policy. So with all that said, we cover a lot of ground. We cover a lot of ground, and we touch every inch of Philadelphia, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the haunting at times. So starting with the good, let's go to the next slide. One of the things that I quickly learned after I moved to Philadelphia and then joining the commission is that Philadelphia is an incredibly diverse city. We are a majority Black city with 40% of our residents being of African descent. 1 in 4 Philadelphians is an immigrant or the first generation born in the United States. 17% of Philadelphians have some form of disability, which is the highest rate of any major US city. We have a very large diversity of religious groups within, especially our Muslim and Jewish populations. And then we also have a very large LGBT population with one of the highest concentrations in the state. So all of these groups are here within the city limits, and we are there to steward them. But also as a department, we are working with something that can inherently bring a lot of trauma with it. And there's a lot of distrust between the people of Philadelphia and the city government. And so as I began to peel back on the archives, I needed to answer that question. What is the why of it? Because we are a public archive. Members of the Philadelphia community are going to be coming in to look at our materials. They're going to be attending meetings, featuring in some of our collections. I wanted to build that trust, especially as a young new archivist. Can we go to the next slide? So I started with looking at some of the larger forces that I had already sort of heard about when exploring city planning and the history of structural racism across the United States. And one of the biggest ones is redlining. Philadelphia was considered one of the blueprint cities for the practice of redlining. This is an actual redlining map of Philadelphia from the Free Libraries collection. And everything that was in red was a place where they were not going to give mortgages to. Anything in yellow was considered a declining area, and anything in blue and green was considered safe to give a mortgage to. Those red and yellow areas, though, are predominantly immigrant communities, and also those of Black residents, of a lot of Jewish residents as well in the early years, and just broadly people who were considered sort of undesirables by the federal government and who were not considered They did not want them to be considered for the federal mortgage programs that were coming out. Many banks then took this determination and incorporated that into their formal policies through actually just using these redlining maps to determine who they would approve, and then also doing things like racial covenants to mandate that homes can only be sold to certain groups of people. So explicitly saying in your deed that this property cannot be owned by a person of color. That ended up colliding a lot with some of the Philadelphia city government's policies as well. There's another image on this slide if you want to reveal it, Rachel. Thank you. So this gentleman here is named Edmund Bacon. He's often called the father of modern Philadelphia, and he is also the father of Kevin Bacon, the actor. He was a idealistic executive director of the Philadelphia City Planning Commission between 1947 and 1970. And he looked at Philadelphia and he saw a lot of problems. There were a lot of major concerns: unsafe housing. There were concerns about transportation, about access to different major civic amenities. And he believed that the way that you answer a lot of those questions is through specifically city planning and taking a lot of those, making bigger executive decisions to help improve the communities. Unfortunately, however, this was a case of great intentions, poor execution, and the road to hell being paved with them. So this created a perfect storm where, as urban renewal started to move into practice and homes were being seized and torn down, that people began to get locked into these communities that had already been redlined and trapped within a cycle of poverty in the city. Let's go on to the next slide to see a couple images relating to that. So on the right-hand side, you can see a lone townhome. This is an example of a block that was renewed. So all of the undesirable or labeled unsafe homes were torn down, and in some cases, single buildings were left to stand, but they were just surrounded by vacant land. There are many areas of Philly where you can still see that presence, where there's like one townhome and then nothing but a vacant lot. Or in many areas, these single properties were left, and then the land was purchased by private developers to then turn into newer housing that was aimed at richer white residents to bring into these neighborhoods. The residents who had been displaced often could not afford them. In addition, larger programs of eminent domain pushed things like the Vine Street Expressway through historic Chinatown here in Philadelphia. And this is a great example of a project that we are still cleaning up after today. In fact, we are spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to cap this expressway and reconnect Chinatown with the Callow Hill and Spring Garden neighborhoods that are directly north of them, and trying to bring back in green space and actually make it so people can actually walk between these areas. But these policies didn't just touch physical consequences. They also included a lot of larger social issues. Because these areas had been labeled as dangerous, as undesirable, there was also a heavy amount of over-policing of these neighborhoods that made everything worse. They emphasized the civic divide between white and Black residents primarily, but also just broadly between white Philadelphians and everyone else. In addition, Philadelphia has 3 major prisons within its borders, and there were 2 during this main period, Eastern State and Holmesburg. And the Corrections Department and the Police Department also became bloated and bold, seeking to target people of color. It created a massive amount of police brutality and violence within our city. And in May 1985, one of the most egregious incidents occurred that actually intersects with our department's history. Please go to the next slide. So the images you're seeing here on screen are from the burning of 6200 Osage Avenue, also known as the Move bombing. This event is one of the most notorious in Philadelphia's history, and it is extremely complicated. I'm going to give a brief overview, just because you could spend an entire panel just talking about this specific situation or write multiple books. But it is critical to understand why people don't trust the Philadelphia city government. So housing and neighborhood dynamics are at the core of the Move crisis. It's a story of land use as much as it is a story of police violence. And following years of conflict with neighbors across West Philadelphia, on May 12, 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department confronted Move at 6221 Osage Avenue with over 500 officers. In the early hours of May 13th, The PPD was given authorization to drop an explosive on top of a residential row home and flush out the 13 people inside that they were trying to take into custody. The 6200 block was then left to burn for over an hour before fire crews were allowed to move in and attempt to extinguish it. 11 people died, 5 of them children, and over 200 people were displaced. 61 homes were destroyed. This is one of 2 times a U.S. government body has bombed its own citizens. The other was in Puerto Rico in 1950. This bombing is very complicated, but the city played a direct role, and our department had an explicit role in the aftermath and the cleanup. The Redevelopment Authority was responsible for the reconstruction of homes and helping survivors resettle. However, the buildings that were put in its place were not well made, and many are condemned today. They also remained out of reach of the displaced residents, or they had already moved on into new neighborhoods by the time they were completed. If you would like to reveal another image on this slide. Thank you. So you can see what the block looked like after the wreckage was cleared. In addition, in the years following, it was later revealed that the remains of the 5 children who had died were mishandled by the Philadelphia City Medical Examiner's Office and the University of Pennsylvania and had not been returned to their family. The University of Pennsylvania had even used some of the remains as teaching aids, as exposed in 2021. In November of last year, the University of Pennsylvania admitted that they had found even more remains, only 2 years after assuring the Africa family, which was at the center of MOVE, that they had no more of their children's remains. The MOVE bombing and its aftermath is critical to understand the big divide between Philadelphia and between the city government and its people. And especially as an archivist in a public municipal archive, we have to understand that in order to properly steward our collections and interact with these members of the public, because you never know who has been affected by this. This event is still in living memory. And in particular, our affiliation with other institutions that have continued to do wrong in relation to this incident is only going to deepen that divide and make things worse, especially when you're dealing with something like treating the dead with dignity and respect. That is a major, major thing that is going to be upsetting and traumatizing to these communities, especially when it is focused on Black bodies and violence against them, even in death. Which brings me to this quick case study that I would like to go over on the next slide, which is the missing bodies of Eastern State Penitentiary. Eastern State, as I said, is one of 2 major prisons that was active in Philadelphia within the last century. It was opened in the 1820s by Quakers who wanted to reform the prison system. They devised solitary confinement that has been widely adopted, and also the beginnings of the prison industrial complex, where prisoners produced consumer goods to support the upkeep of the prison, and then those goods were sold by outside vendors. I think part of the reason why this case study really stuck with me so much is because of the MOVE remains incidents being so fresh in my mind as an archivist in the city, because I really felt a responsibility as this project unfolded to find these people's remains, or at least find where their final resting place was. So can we go on to the next slide, please? So what started as a simple question on an archives tour where the Eastern State team was up visiting seeing some historic blueprints in our collection quickly spiraled into a 3-month research project. The question was simple. Between 1870 and 1900, 92 people died while imprisoned at Eastern State, and they wanted to know where these people had been interred. The only clues were single lines, usually in the warden journals, saying that the person was interred in city ground or on a city burial ground, which was very vague. There were many city-owned burial grounds with no addresses or really other identifying information for where these people had been interred. So I looped in my coworkers on the Philadelphia Historical Commission and also some teammates up at City Archives, and we started to really dig, and I spent multiple hours in the City Archives collection reading through returns of death. And this is where it really started to get to me, and I began to feel a lot of that secondary trauma that Rachel and Leanne had mentioned earlier on. which is I was not just reading about what happened to these individuals, but also the people around them, because the city burial ground, as I later found out, was a potter's field. So it was for anyone who couldn't afford to be buried in a church cemetery or who was unclaimed by their family. And so that included everyone from stillborn infants to murder victims to those who had committed suicide and people who were unrecognizable and without family to come claim them. In addition, as I continued to read and do research, we found a scandal involving the city coroner's office where they had been selling human remains to the University of Pennsylvania's anatomical classes. And that became a new part of this story. Were these individuals potentially a part of that? Luckily, they were not, from what I've been able to piece together. And we were actually able to locate the final resting place of these individuals. Let's go on to the next slide to see where that is. Thank you. So they were interred at the city burial ground on Lamb Tavern Road, which is nowadays known as Rayburn Park in North Philadelphia. There is a photo on the right of Rayburn Park itself showing some of the basketball courts and other amenities. There's a community center, a pool, and there is a high school that is on part of the property and is still city owned. And then on the left, you can see a Google Map screenshot demonstrating the distance between Eastern State and the burial ground. You can also see in the bottom corner, the bottom left corner, the art museum, and then also in the mid right, Temple University, just to sort of ground you with the cityscape. And you can visit it today. And that was actually something that I ended up doing. I went to the site after everything had sort of wrapped up, and I ended up laying some flowers because I wanted to get some closure from this event. It had really, really stuck with me. And it really got me thinking, like, where do we go from here? So next slide. And this is my last slide. So where do we go? So similar to what Leanne said, keeping the archives open, but restricting physical access to potentially upsetting, traumatizing, or re-traumatizing items, or otherwise just keeping sensitive materials out of view. So for example, I did find a book in our collection that has a swastika on it. As a Jewish woman, that was particularly upsetting to find. So I removed it from the main collection, made a note on the finding aid, and made sure that if anyone wants to see it, they have to come to me first, and then we'll discuss their access. The next part is to rebuild that trust. You have to answer questions as honestly as possible while also being respectful of the context. You don't want to use super flowery language. You want to be as clear and concise as possible. And also like leaving that door open for more questions to come your way. Another thing is there's a traumatic stress tip sheet that I will include that's in my resources page that will be next. Give it a read through, practice the care tips, because it's not just great for you, but it's not just great for researchers, but it's great for you to figure out if you are having a traumatic stress reaction, and then you can take care of yourself as well. And finally, you need to lead with humility. Recognize that there are things that you just don't know. Listen to the community voices, listen to your colleagues, and really do like seek out other opinions and advice and research. I appreciated Leanne pointing out looking for resources from the communities in question. That's a really great way to start to build yourself out and process this. So my next slide is just like a bibliography kind of resource page. All right, passing it off to Miranda.
Hello. Hi, my name is Miranda Rectenwald. I have been the curator of the local history collections at Washington University since 2016, and before that, I worked in university archives. Thank you to Rebekah and Leanne for the topics and photographs. And I decided I wouldn't duplicate this because virtually everything you have seen, some form of that is within the collections I oversee in local history. The first collection that I began working with was actually a digital collection from 2014 that we call Documenting Ferguson, which is the death of the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, which was the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. I wasn't involved in the collecting of that, but it was a crowdsourced community digital archive, and it is still one of the collections that we get frequent requests to use. It's fully online. Other things, much as Rebecca showed, St. Louis is unique in that we don't really have a city government that does archives. It does a little bit, but for the most part, city records, because of a laundry list of political issues in St. Louis, far greater than I can list today, they have been scattered to a variety of institutions. And again, much prior to my arriving, one of the collections I oversee, which is something like 500 plus linear feet, is the City of St. Louis mayoral records from basically after World War II. It's 1943. There's not much of World War II in there, through a change in 1981. This includes extensive records of our public housing buildings. St. Louis is one of the first cities in the country to embrace and get federal public housing funding in the 1950s. And our most famous or infamous, depending on which articles you read, is the Pruitt-Igoe Public Housing Complex. This is very much a touch point in our community today. And through greater historical awareness in the past 15 to 20 years, healing has begun because of being able to do that historical research. But I also have many collections that detail numerous sections of the city that were slums, according to our city planning devices, that were cleared for highways, and the issue of eminent domain clearance, much as Rebecca showed in Philadelphia, was very much in St. Louis as well. I didn't list it on here, but also St. Louis was home to a private urban planning firm. So we didn't do Philadelphia because it sounds like you all had your own, but probably about a third of the cities in the United States and some internationally, plus just a lot. They did that level of zoning and urban planning for those cities. So including Evanston, Illinois, and I was able to use some of those documents to work with a historian who contacted me from there. And they were able to use that in writing the first reparations bill for zoning segregation. St. Louis is a de facto segregated city in that we are far enough north that we did not have official Jim Crow segregation laws, but that in a way makes it worse because all of the documentation is in code and sleight of hand, so to speak. Another collection that I oversee and I help researchers and students work with is the ACLU of Missouri records, which spans more than 100 years. It includes huge sections on police violence, prison and jail conditions, and also a lot of our evidence of LGBTQ history when it comes to things like arrests, violence, and discrimination. Most of the collections I oversee and work with are 20th century, but of course, St. Louis sits in Missouri, which was a state that legalized slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so we do have documentation, which is often requested by researchers and students that has to do with documentations of enslavement. So just that super, super speedy, all those topics. So I'm just going to give you a very brief case study. Could you go to the next slide, please, Rachel? When I'm teaching with instructional classes, I have really needed to adopt and come to a trauma-informed lens when working with the local history collections, because pretty much every collection we have that is interesting and that faculty are interested in using in their classes is traumatic. I don't have a lot that's not. And the things I have that are not traumatic aren't the things people want to use. So I was really challenged by a sociological research methods class that came to me a number of years ago. The faculty member was an adjunct faculty member, so he didn't have a lot of time to prepare. This is a sociology class in which one section of their 16-week class would be looking at historical research methods in sociology. I have come to learn that that is a very niche subject in sociology. And so for the faculty member, he was like, great, someone else can teach them this because that's not his strong suit. I had to do a little bit of quick reading about what that meant. But basically, I was going to have one class visit with them. They were coming to special collections. I was not meeting with them beforehand. I had 75 minutes, including them arriving and departing. While they were studying broad topics throughout the semester and how sociology, research topics like sexuality, race, class, issues of childhood, particularly things like juvenile justice system applications, policing, police brutality. Those were all things in the modern sense that they were going to be touching on through at some point throughout the semester. But they were not history students. They were not getting a contextual lesson. They weren't particularly looking at local history, but that's the things we have. So I really decided I would need to approach this very carefully because while the faculty member was enthusiastic and he was like, yes, let's do something about sexuality, let's do something about queer life, let's do something about racism, all of those things. Let's hit all the topics so they get a good broad sense, which I'm on board with. I was concerned that this was going to be a lot for the students coming into. And so I took extra time in developing how I framed this class instruction. Could you go to the next slide, please? Um, so because I only had sort of this one shot, limited time, students are often late, so we don't have the full 70 minutes. Um, I was very intentional with the topics of material that I put at each table. We sort of make little pods of primary sources and materials from different collections. And I purposely marked them with a table tent that said something like sexuality, topics of venereal disease, or policing and arrest brutality. Not anything that gave them more than just literally just like 3 words. Excuse me. I also listed these topics on the board. I think at one point I had a PowerPoint that said them with instructions to say, pick a table, choose a topic. It was their choice. I chose to do this method rather than doing what I had done in other classes, which was kind of tour them around the space and say, okay, this is at this table and this is at this table. Because quite literally, I didn't want to have the students like encountering the things even in that way if they chose not to encounter them. So I really just wanted to very upfront say, you can pick a topic. And then once everyone was there, because the students kind of trickled in, so it was difficult to like stop the first students from looking at things just based on the setup of our room. Once everyone was in and sat at the table, I gave a very purposeful introduction. I chose not to do what the faculty member had kind of leaned towards. He's like, well, just tell them up front, there'll be some things of these topics, they'll be fine. And I purposely chose not to do that. I introduce these topics and I call them heavy topics. I don't like saying that something is traumatic without knowing the students that are there because I have learned that to some students, naming something as traumatic gives it a negative connotation. It gives them the sense that this is bad in somehow. And for some of them, they find it incredibly empowering. They're like, yeah, like that police officer, like, look, his name's in this document and like that's documented. So that's, not just like this nameless act. But, for others, they react differently. So I purposely tell them, we're going to talk about some heavy topics today. Sexuality, venereal disease, police violence. And I restated specifically, I said, if you're at a table and you're like, I'm not really, I think police brutality is an important topic, but I'm not feeling like I have the energy to do that today at this point. And I made sure I had enough chairs and space that, it wasn't like somebody had to trade with them. There was like some empty spaces they could go to. And I was like, just get up and move. It's not a problem. And I also specifically named, and I said, these are heavy topics. You're going to be looking at them closely, literally close to it, touching them, holding them, because that's something about archives. They'd never been to an archive before. I said also, just heavy thinking. So take care of yourself and step away. If you're like, whew, this was a lot, go out, get a drink of water. Nobody's going to say anything to you or look at you strange. And I particularly literally said it like that because I wanted them to know that that was a norm that I was expecting in this class. They didn't know me. I never met them. So I really wanted to just very purposely establish that up front. Could you go to the next slide, please? Um, I have repeated this class more than 4 times, actually, for different faculty. It turns out faculty teach this class in a rotation. I have adapted this for other classes similarly, where I will tell them the topics, I'll tell them up front, and I know we're at time, so this is my last slide. Um, but I have noticed over the course of doing this that most students do not change tables or choose to step out, but some do, and I'm glad that they have that option. And I have noticed that our discussions in class are less awkward. There's less just sort of nervous laughter. Um, it sparks more conversations. Students are willing to be like, oh, yeah, I never thought about the fact that, like, even, yeah, reading the news is a lot to have to take in. And I've noticed that quiet students, particularly if they seem like they're very emotionally engaged, they do tend to speak up more and feel more confident in speaking up and joining the class discussion. And I think that is all I have. I will share a file with some additional notes and things that I relied on in informing this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, all of my group participants. I want to invite anybody to ask questions if they have any.